StoryNarae, the art of storytelling. Heartwarming audiobooks.
Welcome to StoryNarae Classic Horror Literature Special. Today, we present one of Edgar Allan Poe's most haunting tales, The Black Cat. A chilling confession of madness and terror begins now. The Black Cat, Edgar Allan Poe.
This bizarre story that I am about to write is not a lie at all. However, I neither hope that someone will believe it, nor do I want to hope for that. In fact, if I ask you to believe something that I myself cannot believe with my own senses, it will be seen as the ramblings of a madman to those reading this text. I am not crazy. Right now, I am neither mad nor dreaming. However, by tomorrow, I will face death. So today, I leave this confession. Therefore, before today ends, I want to lay down the heavy burden of my heart. The bizarre story I experienced. No one will believe it. Anyway, I intend to tell the world about a series of events that occurred within my family, as they are without adding any explanations. The outcome of that incident plunged me into fear and anguish, ultimately leading me to destruction. However, I will not explain it in detail. It was an event that only brought me fear, but to many others in the world, it might just be considered a ridiculous tale. Thus, it is certain that a person possessing intellect will eventually dismiss even my nightmares as just ordinary trivial matters. Those people will be able to find a continuous causal relationship that is taken for granted even in this situation, which is entangled and trembling with fear like I am. Since I was young, I have been known as a gentle and compassionate child. I was so sensitive that I would be teased by my friends. My parents bought me various pets as I wanted, especially since I loved animals. I spent every day with those animals, and I felt the greatest joy when I fed them and petted them. This unique personality grew stronger as I aged, and by the time I became an adult, loving animals became my only joy. For those who have ever felt affection for a loyal and clever dog, it is unnecessary to explain how great the joy gained from this is. For someone who has experienced the shallow friendships and frivolous loyalties of humans multiple times, there is something heartwarming to be felt in the selfless, devoted affection of animals. I married my wife early, and fortunately her personality was similar to mine. Seeing that I love animals, my wife brought home several cute pets. Thus, our house came to have a small bird, a goldfish, a clever dog, a rabbit, a tiny monkey, and a cat living together. Among them, the cat was a very large and handsome fellow, completely black and surprisingly intelligent. Whenever the cleverness of this cat became a topic of conversation, my somewhat superstitious wife would often bring up the saying, "All black cats are the embodiment of witches." However, my wife didn't truly believe that, and I too am just jotting down that saying, as it randomly came to mind now. Pluto, the king of the underworld, that was the name of the cat, was my beloved playmate. I always fed it, and it followed me around wherever I went in the house. Even when I went out, it tried to follow me, and stopping it was no easy task. Our friendship lasted for several years, but during that time, my temperament and personality changed so much because of alcohol. It's embarrassing to admit that I could hardly recognize myself from the day before. I have become increasingly moody day by day, getting angry easily and no longer considering the feelings of others at all. I started to curse at my wife and eventually resorted to violence. Of course, even the animals I used to cherish began to feel the change in my temperament. Not only did I neglect to take care of the animals, but I also began to abuse them. However, I have not yet reached out to Pluto. When rabbits, monkeys, and dogs approached me by chance or out of joy, I mercilessly made their lives miserable. However, my illness, what illness could be worse than drinking? Gradually worsened until it finally reached Pluto, who is now old and somewhat finicky, and he experienced my illness without exception. One night, after getting completely drunk at my usual tavern and returning home, I sensed that Pluto was avoiding me. I caught the cat. Then that guy lunged at my wrist, seemingly startled by my violent attitude, leaving a light wound. In that moment, I became a prisoner of a demonic rage and forgot myself. My pure soul vanished from my body in an instant, and a twisted, drunken hatred shook me to my core. I took a small knife out of my vest pocket, grabbed the cat by the neck, and calmly gouged out one of its eyes. As I wrote down this terrifying and brutal act, my face flushed, my heart raced, and my body trembled. The next morning, with the effects of the alcohol somewhat faded and my senses restored, I felt a mix of fear and remorse about the crime I had committed. However, that too ultimately proved to be weak and temporary, and it could not shake the roots of my heart. I am still spending my time in heavy drinking, completely burying all memories of that behavior in alcohol. Meanwhile, the cat gradually started to heal from its wounds. The gouged-out hole in the eye was certainly a terrifying sight, but it seemed to no longer feel any pain. I wandered around the house as usual, but whenever I got close, it would run away and hide in fear. At first, the cat's changed behavior felt a bit sad. However, this feeling soon turned into anger, and a mischievous impulse surged up, as if to push me into an abyss of destruction from which I could never be saved. Philosophy has yet to provide any explanation for this aspect of human nature. However, this very nature is one of the primal impulses inherent in the human mind, a fundamental function that shapes human character and is a type of emotion. I believe without a doubt that it exists, as if my soul truly does. How many people in the world commit foolish acts repeatedly, knowing they shouldn't? Even with excellent discernment, isn't there always a desire to break the law simply because it is the law? In other words, this mischievous impulse has led me to my own destruction. The one who continued to abuse innocent animals, ultimately leading to their destruction, was the insatiable desire of this incomprehensible soul that blames itself and abuses its own nature, giving rise to evil deeds because of its own evil actions. One morning, I calmly put a rope around the cat's neck and hung it from a branch. Tears flowed down my cheeks, and despite the heartache of my sorrowful regrets, I still hung the cat by its neck. What broke my heart was knowing that the cat loved me and had not done anything to provoke my anger. Yet I felt it was a sin to act this way. It was also because I knew that ultimately my immortal soul, if such a thing exists, would be cast into a deep abyss that even God's infinite mercy could not save. On the night I committed this horrific act, I was awakened from my sleep by the sound of someone shouting, "Fire!" The bed and curtains were engulfed in flames, and the house was completely a sea of fire. My wife, the maid, and I barely escaped, but the house was completely burned down. All my possessions turned to ashes, and since then I have been unable to escape from despair. I don't think there is any relationship between this disaster and my cruel actions. However, since I am telling a series of facts as they are, I don't want to leave out even one detail. The next day, I went to see the burned site. Only one side of the wall remained, while everything else had collapsed. However, the partition wall where my bed's headboard was placed remained untouched by the fire. I thought it was because it had been freshly painted with lime not long ago. Many people gathered around the edge of the wall, closely examining a particular part of it. How fascinating! There are all sorts of strange things. Drawn in by such sounds, I approached the wall and saw the image of a gigantic cat, seemingly etched shallowly into the white wall. It was astonishingly accurate, and there was a rope wrapped around the cat's neck. This creature, I could only think of it as a monster, filled me with terrible surprise and fear. But I managed to regain my composure. I remembered that the place where the cat was hanged was a barn. Fire! At the sound of this, people quickly gathered in the yard. One of them must have thrown a cat's corpse into my room through the open window to wake me up from my sleep. However, due to the walls collapsing on the other side, the cat's corpse was pressed against the freshly painted wall, and the lime from the wall likely created this shape due to the reaction with the ammonia released from the flames and the corpse. As I thought up to this point, regardless of my conscience, it became a reasonable explanation for my rationality. However, that fact left a strong impression on me. For several days, I couldn't escape the illusion of the cat. During that time, a vague feeling began to sprout in my heart, which is different from regret, but close to it. Feeling sad about losing that cat, I started to look around for another cat with a similar fur color, wandering into cheap bars I used to frequent. One night, sitting dazed and drunk in a bar, I suddenly realized that something black was curled up on the only piece of furniture in the room, which was a rum barrel. It was truly strange that I only just realized it after staring at that barrel for a while. I approached it closely and touched it. It was a black cat. It was a creature similar in size to Pluto, identical to him except for one spot. While Pluto was completely black, this cat had a large, faint white spot all around its chest area. As soon as I reached out my hand, the cat quickly got up, stretched its neck, and rubbed its body against my hand, acting all sweet. This is the cat I was looking for. I soon told the shop owner to give me that cat. However, the shop owner replied that it wasn't his. He didn't know where it came from, and he had never seen the cat before. I stood up to go home after petting the cat for a while. Then the cat seemed to want to follow me as well. I let it follow me. As I walked, I occasionally bent down to gently pat the cat's back. When I got home, the cat quickly became tame, and my wife also liked it. However, one day I felt a growing aversion to this cat deep within my heart. I couldn't help but feel anxious just thinking that the cat was definitely following me. Thus, the feelings of disgust and embarrassment gradually intensified, eventually turning into extreme hatred. I avoided the cat. Perhaps due to a sense of shame and the memory of the cruel acts committed before, I did not torment the cat. For several weeks I did not hit or treat it roughly. However, gradually, very gradually, I began to feel an indescribable hatred towards the cat, and I started to avoid its ominous presence, as if I were evading the breath of an infected person. Moreover, the next morning after bringing the cat home, Discovering that it also had one eye blind like Pluto fueled my hatred. However, because it was missing one eye, my wife seemed to feel even more pity for it. As I mentioned earlier, my wife possessed a lot of this kind of kindness, which had previously been the source of my outstanding character and all sorts of simple and humble joys. However, the more I hated, the more it seemed that the cat loved me. With a certain persistence, it followed me everywhere I went, always curling up under the chair, or jumping onto my lap to lick me, or rubbing its ominous body against me. Also, when I tried to get up and walk, it would crawl between my legs, almost causing me to trip, and it would climb up my clothes with its long, sharp claws, reaching up to my chest. At those times, I felt an overwhelming urge to strike and kill instantly, but I managed to hold back with immense patience. It was partly because the memory of the horrific act I had committed before was still vivid, but in truth, to be clear, it was because I was terrified of the cat and couldn't endure it. This sense of fear was not solely about physical harm. However, I cannot call it differently. It's embarrassing to confess, yes, even now in this prison cell for serious offenders. I still feel ashamed the fear and thrill that cat gave me were truly fueled by a foolish delusion. My wife has repeatedly pointed out the one difference between the cat I killed before and this annoying cat now, which is the white spot. The stain is large but very faint. However, gradually, almost imperceptibly, my reason has denied it for a long time, the outline has become clearer, revealing a shape that is horrifying to even mention. That is exactly why I hated and feared that cat more than anything else, and if I could, I wanted to kill that monster. Now, that gallows was a sight so chilling that it sent shivers down my spine. It represented a terrifying and ominous fear, guilt, and the form of death itself. Now my misery had thoroughly surpassed all the misery that could possibly exist in the world. Moreover, how can a mere beast, the one I have sincerely despised and killed, bring such unbearable torment to me? A human created in the image of God. Ah, I have already found no joy in rest, neither day nor night. During the day, that cat did not leave my side for a moment. And at night, I was tormented by unspeakably terrifying dreams, waking up almost every hour. When I woke up, the hot breath of that ominous beast covered my face, and I felt the heavy weight, the embodiment of a devil that I had no strength to shake off, resting heavily on my chest. Crushed by such pain, even the small kindness that remained in my heart crumbled away. Evil thoughts, very dark and sinister thoughts, became my only companion in my heart. The difficult personality that had existed for a long time gradually worsened, turning into hatred towards everything and everyone. Thus, now in an uncontrollable and explosive rage that seems to unconditionally surrender the body. The one who suffered the most and endured with the most patience was, my wife, who never complained. One day, my wife came down to the basement of our old house, where we were living in poverty, for some reason. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and because of that, I suddenly became extremely excited, almost tumbling backwards. Without even realizing it, I gripped the hatchet so tightly that I was filled with rage. Forgetting even the childish fear that had been suppressing me all this time, I tried to strike down at the cat immediately. If I had struck as I intended, the cat would have died on the spot. However, that blow was halted by my wife's restraining hand. Overwhelmed by rage that even the devil could not withstand due to this interference, I shook off my wife's hand and instead drove the axe into the center of her head. My wife collapsed on the spot, unable to even scream. Once this terrifying murder was over, I soon became absorbed in thinking of a careful way to hide the body. However, whether it was day or night, it was utterly impossible to take the body out of the house without being noticed by the neighbors. Various methods came to mind. I even thought about chopping up the body and burning it. I considered digging a hole in the basement floor and burying it there. Or I thought about either throwing it into the well in the yard or packaging it nicely in a box to make it look like a product, then hiring workers to carry it out of the house. Thus, in the end, a much better method came to mind. I decided to put the body inside the wall of the basement and seal it up. Just like the records of medieval priests sealing victims inside walls. This basement was perfect for such a purpose. After carelessly stacking the wall and recently just applying a coat of whitewash, it was still in an uncured state due to the humid air. Moreover, on one side of the wall, there was a protrusion that had a decorative flue and stove filled in to make it look the same as the other parts. Removing the bricks from that place and putting in a corpse, then reapplying the wall so that it looked unremarkable to anyone, was undoubtedly an easy task. It was indeed as I expected. Using a crowbar, I easily removed the bricks, carefully, propped the body against the inner wall, and then rebuilt the wall with the bricks. Then I mixed mortar, sand, and hair, and carefully spread the mixture evenly over the newly laid bricks. When the work was finished, I felt a sense of satisfaction that everything was done. The wall showed no signs of having been touched at all. I picked up every single speck of dust that had fallen on the floor. I looked around proudly and talked to myself. Well, at least it wasn't a wasted effort. The next task was to find the cat that had caused this tragedy. I decided to kill that cat. If it had only caught my eye back then, the cat's fate would have been sealed. However, this cunning animal seemed to be scared of my previous intense anger and didn't show itself in front of me. When that ominous cat disappeared, I felt such a lightness and a sense of relief that I couldn't possibly express it in words or even imagine it. The cat did not show up all night that day. Thanks to that, I was able to sleep comfortably for the first time since bringing it home. Yes, even though the weight of having committed murder pressed down on my mind, I was able to sleep peacefully. 2 days and 3 days have passed, but the cat that tormented me still hasn't appeared. I was able to breathe again, becoming free once more. The monster that instilled fear has escaped from this house forever. Thinking that I would never see that cat again brought me immense happiness. Although I wasn't completely free from the fear of the sins I committed, I was able to answer the interrogations without much trouble. And when my house was searched, nothing was found. With this, I believed that my future happiness was guaranteed. On the 4th day since I killed my wife, unexpectedly a group of officers rushed in and began a thorough search of the house again. However, I was completely confident that the place where I hid the body would never be found, so I was not the least bit flustered. At the officer's command, I also joined in the search. I searched every nook and cranny of the house. Finally, I went down to the basement for the 3rd or 4th time. My expression didn't change at all. My heart was quietly beating like a child sleeping innocently. I walked around leisurely with my arms crossed over my chest. The officers were completely easing their suspicions and were about to leave the house. I couldn't suppress my joy. I couldn't bear it any longer and wanted to say a word to the target of victory to further assure my innocence. Unable to hold back, I finally spoke to the officers going up the stairs. Everyone, I am happier than anything that my doubts have been resolved. I wish you all good health, and I hope you will act with more courtesy in the future. By the way, this house is really well structured. I was overwhelmed by a fierce desire to babble about anything, not even knowing what I was saying. You could truly say it's a well-built house, can't you? Above all, the wall. No, are you all going to leave? What do you think of the sturdiness of this wall? Saying this, I was completely agitated and struck the wall, where my wife's corpse lay with the stick I was holding like a madman. Then, oh God, save me from the devil's fangs. Before the echo of the blow had even faded, a sound that seemed to respond from the grave was heard. At first, it was a muffled sound like a child's cry, intermittently breaking off. But soon it transformed into a long, high, and uninterrupted strange scream that could hardly be believed to be a human voice. It was the joy of the dead who had fallen into hell and their destruction. It was a howl that flowed simultaneously from the throat of a raging demon, a mix of fear and triumph that could only be heard in hell. In that moment, I felt faint and staggered as if I would collapse against the opposite wall. For a while, the scenery on the stairs stood still, caught in fear and astonishment. In the next moment, 5 or 6 strong arms rushed in and began to break down the wall. The wall collapsed with a crash. A nearly decomposed, blood-soaked corpse stood starkly before everyone's eyes. And above its head sat a terrifying cat with a wide-open crimson mouth and a fiery single eye. That cat cunningly lured me into committing murder, and now it was leading me to the gallows with its strange screams. I had buried this monster in a grave hole, plastered with the corpse inside the wall.
You have just listened to Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat. In the end, the cat's gaze revealed the darkest truths of the human soul. Thank you for joining StoryNarae's classic audiobook series. Subscribe and enable notifications so you won't miss the next story. Thank you.